Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. As a reminder, members participating in this hearing remotely should be visible on camera throughout the hearing. As with in-person meetings, members are responsible for controlling their own microphone. Members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. In addition, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository at sccc.repository@mail.house.gov. Finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical problems should inform the committee staff immediately. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this remote hearing. Today, we will hear about financial incentives and investments to create jobs and accelerate deployment of clean energy and clean vehicles. And I'll recognize myself right now for 5 minutes. Well, thanks in large part to American research and innovation, we can now power our homes and cars and businesses in ways that pollute less and cost less. Solar and wind have become two of the cheapest sources of power in America, and energy efficiency saves families hundreds on their utility bills. It's now cheaper to drive an electric car than a gas-powered one, thanks to lower maintenance costs and other savings over the lifetime of a vehicle. On Tuesday, I had a chance to check out Ford's new electric pickup truck, the F-150 Lightning. I love the name, by the way. It's an impressive vehicle. It was built by union workers right here in America. The modern wave of all sorts of clean technologies will save Americans money, help create jobs as we make progress on solving the climate crisis. And that's good news because we know that we must act urgently to reduce carbon pollution. We're already facing the growing risks and costs of the climate crisis. We go through this every hearing: heat waves, wildfires, extreme storms, sea level rise that threaten the lives and livelihoods of millions of our neighbors back home. So in this committee and in Congress, we've heard from scientists that America needs to reach net zero emissions as soon as possible, no later than 2050. And we need to lead by example so that the rest of the world will join us in finding global climate solutions. And the key to a clean economy is clean electricity. The good news is that our nation's electricity sector has reduced carbon pollution in the last decade. But the reality is that we have to do more, and we have to do it quickly. Clean electricity helps unlock further pollution cuts in other sectors of the economy, including transportation, buildings, and industry. And in order to cut US carbon pollution by more than half by 2030, as President Biden pledged to the world that we will do, we need to implement climate solutions in every sector. And that's why the federal policies and investments that we're discussing today are so important. The federal government needs to help everyone, from homeowners to heads of companies. We've got to help everyone make the shift to clean technologies. We know that these clean technologies will improve the lives of our neighbors, leading to cleaner air, healthier communities, and a more sustainable economy. Our job is to help American families and businesses make that transition, especially as so many of them are still recovering from the economic impacts of the COVID pandemic. That's why Congress must support expanded access to technologies that are already available, making them more affordable and building on the progress that we have already made. Because while we've helped bring down the cost of climate solutions, we still have a lot of work to do when it comes to deploying them at the scale the climate crisis requires. So that's what we're going to focus on today. We'll discuss how we can use financial incentives and smart investments that can help families afford cleaner energy. We'll talk about how we can accelerate the deployment of zero-emission cars and trucks. And we'll discuss how to create jobs in clean energy and electric vehicle manufacturing. These jobs come with high road labor standards and family sustaining wages. And as you'll hear from one of our witnesses today, access to financing, though, can be a critical barrier to upgrading homes for Americans. But cutting carbon pollution from houses and strengthening them to withstand the climate crisis hazards is necessary now. And we'll hear about progress, or we'll hear about success in overcoming these barriers at the state level. And we'll hear about the opportunities that a national initiative will provide to protect property, cut energy bills, and reduce pollution. When it comes to solving the climate crisis, we need to empower everyone to take concrete steps to make a difference, and ensuring that clean energy solutions provide good opportunities and that they are within reach of all Americans. I know we can do this. So now let's make it happen. So with that, I'll recognize our ranking member, Mr. Graves, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. I look forward to your testimony. And I really welcome this hearing this morning, because we do need to look at where we are investing our precious taxpayer resources to get the best return on investment. We've got to make sure that we're incorporating more science into this discussion to ensure that the investments we're making are the most efficient at actually reducing emissions and plotting a course, not just to a clean energy future in the United States, but one that will actually result in a clean energy future globally. I've heard many witnesses come before the committee and talk about how solar and wind are the most cheapest forms of electricity, the most inexpensive forms of electricity. Yet, for 30 years, we've been subsidizing those forms of electricity through the ITC and the PTC. If they're the most affordable, should we be diverting those resources to other types of incentives that will actually help to reduce global emissions? And I keep making reference to global because, as we all know, this is a global problem, and there's not anything that we can do exclusively in the United States that will help to turn the corner. The chair in her opening noted the challenges that we're experiencing in the United States. And let's be clear, there is no trajectory that we're on right now that will change or avert that future unless there is a significant change in global emissions reductions. The Paris Accords that have been largely celebrated actually codify an increase in global emissions. If you look, for example, just at China, which now emits more than every developed country in the world combined, under the agreement, they get to increase their emissions another 50% between now and 2030. That's the wrong direction. And the reality is that our investments, our financing, our tax incentives have to be deployed in a way that's strategic and recognizes not just the reality in the United States, but the global reality, because you will never have an uptake in more expensive energy solutions in developing countries. You're not going to have the ability to afford those types of energy solutions. You're not going to have the exportability of those energy solutions. We also have to recognize other facts, like the fact that global energy demand is projected to increase another 50% between now and 2050, just over the next 29 years. Natural gas alone is projected to have a 40% increase in demand over that same time period. Where's that going to come from? Where are those energy sources going to come from? Are they going to be affordable and exportable to some of these third world countries? Who's going to provide that natural gas? Is it going to be the United States that currently has a 40+% lower emissions profile than Russian gas? And what role will technologies like carbon capture, storage, and utilization play, which in some cases, unfortunately, I've heard people demonize, but I think the reality is that we're going to see it probably play one of the most important roles in a clean energy future. And that's why I am encouraged that the Biden administration has embraced it. It's why I'm encouraged that entities like the Nature Conservancy and National Wildlife Federation have endorsed it. It's why I'm encouraged that Senators Bennett, Duckworth, Tester, Whitehouse, Kane, which are all Democrats, and Senator King, who's an independent, released a statement saying, "We urge you to support programs of the Department of Energy develop and deploy carbon capture, utilization, and storage technologies in partnership with the private sector." Madam Chair, I think we found ourselves in a scenario whereby we are often looking at solutions based on faith and emotion rather than science, economics, and facts. And I'm concerned that we're going to try to squeeze that last drop of emissions out of certain sectors, whether it be transportation or energy, and the cost for that last ton is going to be so excessively expensive. And we're not going to be looking at how can we most affordably chart that clean energy future in a way that will truly receive uptake from the global community and turn the emissions trajectory we're on now in a different direction. So again, I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today. I welcome this hearing and yield back.
Terrific. Now we're going to hear from our witnesses. They are all prominent leaders and researchers on financial policies that can help ensure that every American can access clean energy and drive clean vehicles. Duane Andrade is the Chief Financial and Strategic Officer of the Solar and Energy Loan Fund in Florida. She leads development of innovative financing programs to help low and moderate income Floridians make their homes more sustainable through energy efficiency, renewable energy, and climate resilience. Ms. Andrade previously worked as a consultant for startups focused on environmental justice, sustainability, and clean energy finance models. John Larson is a director at Rhodium Group and leads the firm's U.S. power sector and energy systems research. He specializes in analysis of clean energy policy and market trends. Previously, Mr. Larson worked for the Department of Energy's Office of Energy Policy and Systems Analysis and as an electric power policy advisor. Rich Powell is the executive director of ClearPath, an organization whose mission is to advance clean energy innovation. Mr. Powell served as a member of the 2019 advisory committee to the Export-Import Bank of the United States, and he is also on the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Centers Advisory Group. And Zoe Lippman is the Director of Manufacturing and Advanced Transportation at the Blue Green Alliance. She leads their policy and advocacy work on clean technology manufacturing and advanced vehicles and transportation. A former trade union official, she previously led the National Wildlife Federation's program on fuel economy and advanced and electric vehicles and headed the organization's Midwest Climate Policy Program. Without objection, the witnesses' written statements will be made part of the record. And with that, Ms. Andrade, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to summarize your testimony. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Chair Castor, Ranking Member Graves, and members of the Select Committee. It is a great honor for me to be here with you today in this important hearing. My name is Duane Andrade, and I am the Chief Financial and Strategic Officer for Florida's Green Bank, the Solar and Energy Loan Fund, known also as SELF. This Select Committee is already well informed on the science behind the climate crisis. So today, I'd like to focus on why we need to invest in clean energy and resilience, how SELF is doing this despite scarce resources, and what we need to do so we can scale and benefit communities in an equitable and sustainable way across America. SELF is a nonprofit community development finance institution known as a CDFI. We're also a founding member of the American Green Bank Consortium. We're based in Florida and have pilot programs in South Carolina, Alabama, and in a few weeks, we're going to be opening up Georgia, next Tennessee, and Texas. Our mission is to provide access to affordable financing for sustainable property improvements, which mean basically making unsecured loans for clean energy and climate resilient improvements to low and moderate income populations with low credit scores, basically high efficiency ACs, fortified roofs, impact windows and doors, solar, battery storage, and more. SELF has a 10-year track record serving LMI homeowners with unsecured loans based on ability to repay, not credit scores. LMI populations have typically lower credit scores and are perceived as subprime, which connotes high risk in the traditional financing system. And it makes them less likely to access affordable financing and makes them vulnerable to predatory lenders. SELF has grown by 400% over the last 3 years and completed over 2,100 sustainable home improvements totaling over $19 million. And 73% of our loans have been to LMI homeowners with low credit scores mostly, and our average default rate is less than 2%. Self-success bears testament to the demand for climate resiliency and proof of the creditworthiness of LMI households. LMI households make up about 40% of American households. They tend to live in older housing with outdated building standards, which often lead to higher energy burdens and higher insurance rates, if they can afford that at all. Due to low credit scores, they also lack access to affordable capital to make energy efficiency and climate resiliency improvements that would reduce energy costs, climate risk, and also carbon emissions. According to a recent study, 32 million homes in America are at risk from hurricanes alone. This makes me think of our client, Alice, a 62-year-old woman with a serious spinal disease who lives on fixed income. Her roof was caving in, and she was about to lose her insurance right before hurricane season. Because of her medical bills, her credit was low, and she had been denied access to fix her roof and retain insurance. She did not qualify for traditional financing. So one of our contractors referred her to us, and we were able to finance a new roof. She was able to secure insurance. She was able to secure the only and probably most valuable asset that she has, which is her home. Alice said, quote, "Self-help me save my home," quote. Another client, Joe, is a combat wounded veteran who told Self that his kids were suffering in the sweltering heat of Florida last summer when his AC went out. It seems like something so quotidian, so normal. However, it is life-changing and it has huge health impacts. He couldn't get a loan, not even from the VA. So a contractor referred him to us, and we were able to give him a small unsecured loan to get a new AC, providing quality of life and energy efficiency. Self has over 700 approved contractors in our network who use our financing to create more business. They've told us that without Self, they'd lose anywhere between 20 to 40% of business due to clients lacking access to financing. One of our contractors, Seacoast, has done more than $1 million in projects. At Self, we get constant inquiries from other states, cities, and organizations asking us to bring our services to their communities. The demand is there. What we're missing is sufficient capital to meet all the demand. Self and other green banks across the nation are innovative and specialize in bridging financing gaps. Collectively, we have decades of experience underwriting energy savings, climate risk, and energy efficiency. Funding an independent nonprofit accelerator would have a large impact, much more than its initial capitalization from Congress, because green banks can leverage private capital up to 8 times. For example, with $100 billion in the accelerator, we could generate $880 billion in total investments in the first 5 years and create up to 5.5 million jobs. This is why we need Congress to fund an independent accelerator to do just that, accelerate equitable investments to build more resilient communities while fostering sustainable jobs and transitioning to a clean energy economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Next, we'll go to Mr. Larson. You are now recognized for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you, Chair Castor. Thank you, Ranking Member Graves and members of the committee for inviting me to speak today. My name is John Larson. I am a director at Rhodium Group, an independent research firm whose research informs decision makers in the public, private, and philanthropic sectors. I lead Rhodium Group's U.S. energy systems research, where we focus on analyzing clean energy policies, emerging clean technologies, and market trends. I'm also a non-resident senior associate in the Energy Security and Climate Change program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today about how Congress can create financial incentives and investments to accelerate clean energy technologies and create good-paying jobs. To tackle the challenge of climate change, the U.S. needs to rapidly deploy clean energy technologies across the energy system and quickly cut carbon pollution. There are a variety of policies that can accelerate this transition. Recent Rhodium research shows that updating and enhancing clean energy tax credits have the potential to increase the average annual rate of wind and solar installations on the grid by more than double last year's record of 30 gigawatts. An enhanced clean energy tax credit framework can drive electric power CO2 emissions down as much as 73% compared to 2005 levels and save or create up to 600,000 jobs on an annual average basis. All this can be done with little impact on national average electric bills, while also cutting harmful SO2 and NOx pollution in half from today's levels in just 5 years. While electric power CO2 emissions have dropped in the US by 40% since 2005, our research shows that under current policy, including the current tax credit regime, this progress will stall out in the next few years. At best, the electric power sector maintains emissions in the range of 46 to 50% below 2005 levels in 2030 without new federal action. Modernizing clean energy tax credits for the decade ahead can cut US electric power CO2 emissions to 64 to 73% below 2005 levels by 2031. This is up to 8 times more emission reductions than simply extending the current clean energy tax credit framework. To achieve these outcomes, Rhodium Group identified 5 critical improvements to the current tax credit framework. They are as follows. Number 1, first, extend the investment tax credit, the ITC, and the production tax credit, the PTC, over a long-term period, such as 10 years. 2, increase the value of the tax credits back to their initial levels, 30% of project costs for the ITC and $25 a megawatt hour for the PTC. While these first 2 points are essential, alone they cut US electric power emissions down to as low as 55% below 2005 levels in 2031. Adding more enhancements can amplify these reductions. Number 3, if you provide flexibility to allow developers of any clean generating technology to claim the ITC or PTC, whichever makes sense for them, that will also accelerate deployment of clean technologies. And number 4, providing a direct pay provision or refundability provision to prevent financing bottlenecks will be important to avoid constraining clean energy deployment. All 4 of these enhancements together can drive emissions down to as low as 61% below 2005 levels in 2031. But the US can double these gains again by including a 5th enhancement, incentivizing existing clean energy resources to stay on the grid. Retaining economically distressed existing clean generation, such as nuclear plants, helps to make sure that all new clean energy additions to the US grid, such as wind and solar, only displace uncontrolled fossil generation and accelerate progress towards meeting clean energy goals. These 5 enhancements combined can slash emissions and save or create hundreds of thousands of jobs. Even after accounting for declines in fossil fuel jobs, enhanced tax credits can create or retain up to 600,000 jobs on an annual average basis from 2022 through 2031. Clean energy tax credits have the potential to establish renewable energy as the largest energy sector employer in America over the next decade, surpassing the oil industry and the natural gas industry. Enhanced tax credits can also serve as a foundation to complement other policy actions, such as a clean electric standard or pollution regulations. Congress can also tailor tax credits to help achieve other policy goals, such as supporting emerging clean technologies and directing investment toward disadvantaged communities. Rhodium Group recently published research that also explores how tax credits can accelerate clean energy deployment in the transportation sector and in the industrial sectors of the energy system. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today. I look forward to your questions about our research and findings.
Thank you very much. Next up, Mr. Powell, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Good morning, Chair Castor, Ranking Member Graves, and members of the Select Committee. My name is Rich Powell. I lead ClearPath. ClearPath advances policies that accelerate breakthrough innovations that reduce emissions in the energy and industrial sectors. An important note, we're supported by philanthropy, not industry. Climate change is real, and industrial activity around the globe is the dominant contributor. I believe the challenge it poses to society merits significant action at every level of government and the private sector. Lawmakers and businesses across the country are prioritizing investments in climate solutions. Florida established a fund providing up to $100 million annually for climate resiliency projects, and Louisiana has a $50 billion coastal master plan. Since 1980, the United States has spent $1.9 trillion in disaster recovery from 290 separate billion-dollar events. If we don't better prepare, we will massively deepen deficit spending. As the committee looks at federal incentives for clean energy, I will discuss 5 key points. First, a portfolio approach to clean energy innovation. Second, the 45Q tax incentive for carbon capture. Third, opportunities for enhancing 45Q. Fourth, the new energy sector innovation credit. And finally, building on the bipartisan clean energy innovation record. While the US and a few others have reversed emissions trajectories, much of the rest of the world is growing their emissions as they grow their populations, industries, and quality of life. We need an American, innovation-focused approach to solving the global climate challenge. There is no tax or domestic regulation that will magically halt emissions around the world. We must focus on strengthening the American economy, not ceding ground to Russia and China. Reducing American emissions is essential, and we have seen a significant decline already. But even if the US somehow eliminated all of its carbon emissions tomorrow, just the growth in emissions from today through 2050 by developing Asian countries would exceed total US emissions today. Why? Clean technology available today is simply not up to the task of global economy-wide decarbonization, which is why we need to focus on breakthroughs that offer both better performance and lower costs. If Congress leads with an innovation-focused agenda, we can guide basic and applied R&D for clean energy innovation through to commercialization. America will lead in creating jobs, reestablishing global leadership, and driving down global emissions. To do this, we will first need to drive down the cost of clean energy. Smart tax incentive policy has a proven record, from natural gas to wind and solar. Carbon capture remains one of the most promising clean energy technologies. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the International Energy Agency have stated that carbon capture and storage is essential to achieving net zero emissions. The federal carbon capture tax credit, affectionately known as 45Q, is viewed as the single most useful tool in spurring carbon capture project development. Most recently, a 2-year extension of 45Q was passed as part of the Energy Act of 2020. Recent modeling from the Rhodium Group, and I'm delighted to be here with John today, determined a permanent extension generated gigatons of emissions reductions and new investments in both the power and industrial sectors. Their analysis found benefits up to 157,000 job years by 2035, 52 gigawatts of power sector carbon capture deployment by 2050, deployment on industrial facilities in more than 30 states, and 4 gigatons of emission reductions by 2050 across both power and industry. Expanding and extending 45Q is an idea that has been led on by Republicans, most notably in Leader McCarthy's energy innovation agenda launched this year, and is gaining bipartisan appeal due to the environmental benefits. Currently, there are a variety of bipartisan proposals that could enable widespread deployment. A recent National Petroleum Council report highlighted the 45Q extension and significant expansion, in line with Leader McCarthy's expanded bill of earlier this year, could incentivize an additional 350 to 400 million tons per year of carbon capture capacity, bringing the total U.S. capacity to 500 million tons per year. One reason 45Q is so effective, it incentivizes emissions reductions in both the power sector and heavy industrial processes like cement and chemicals manufacturing and the transportation fuel sectors, unlike renewable energy tax credits for the power sector alone. Going beyond carbon capture, Ways and Means members just this Tuesday introduced the Energy Sector Innovation Credit, or ESIC, a bipartisan energy tax proposal to encourage innovation in the clean energy sector. A companion bill was also introduced in the Senate. ESIC creates incentives for breakthrough innovation for power generation and storage technologies, a game-changing market signal for private sector innovators. It also includes a clean hydrogen production credit. ESIC will help rapidly scale and diversify clean energy technologies through innovation to achieve long-term emissions targets, create jobs, and provide safe and reliable energy. For each breakthrough, the incentive automatically ramps down as technologies commercialize, not an arbitrary date like traditional energy credits. The credit could incentivize gigawatts of new clean generation, including for advanced nuclear, enhanced geothermal systems, offshore wind, long-duration storage, and next-generation solar. As you craft this agenda, and I cannot emphasize this enough, partisan climate policy is not sustainable. It results in short-term uncertainty and does not provide the market signals we need to move to a clean energy economy. We can start by building on recent bipartisan wins. If you pair bipartisan efforts like the Energy Act of 2020 with tax incentive policy like 45Q and ESIC, Congress will send an undeniable message that lawmakers are serious about leading on clean, reliable energy breakthrough. breakthroughs. Thank you for this opportunity. We applaud the Select Committee for taking on this important task.
Terrific. Thanks so much. Next up, Ms. Lippman, you are recognized for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you, Chair Castor, Ranking Member Graves, and members of the committee. I am Zoe Lippman, Director of Manufacturing and Advanced Transportation at the Blue-Green Alliance, which brings together labor unions and environmental organizations to build a clean, thriving, and equitable economy. America is a good investment. Working people across the country are counting on Congress to see that. Investments to rebuild and retool American manufacturing, modernize our infrastructure systems, invest in our care economy, and create high-quality clean energy jobs are needed now and are needed at scale. They will be essential to addressing the climate crisis and to ensuring a real and equitable recovery. We cannot build back better if we fall behind the rest of the world in manufacturing the technology of the future here in the United States, or if the workers and communities that need it most fail to see the benefits of innovation or a cleaner economy. That means investing not only in deploying climate solutions, but making equally central investments in manufacturing, good jobs, and revitalizing communities. Nowhere is this more true than in the coming shift to electric vehicles. EVs are coming. The actions and investments that policymakers make now will determine whether the US economy, workers, and communities see the gains from the transformation of the transportation sector. If done right, the shift to EVs will not only play a critical role in addressing climate change, but it can strengthen domestic manufacturing and supply chains, secure and grow good jobs, and help reverse decades-long declines in job quality and access to middle-class careers for manufacturing workers and workers of color. However, if policymakers fail to act, we risk being left behind in the next generation of automotive manufacturing and ceding future industries to global competitors. So what does this mean for Congress? We need to invest now to make the US a leading market for EVs and do so with conditions that support working people. In addition to globally competitive clean vehicle standards that give companies the certainty to invest here, we need incentives for deployment to ensure faster, broader, and fairer consumer and fleet adoption of domestically manufactured electric vehicles, from cars and trucks to school buses, and to extend EV charging infrastructure to all those who will need it. And all of our public investments, regardless of how financed, must come with strong labor standards and incentivize domestic manufacturing throughout the supply chain. For example, it is vital to update the Section 30D plug-in electric drive vehicle credit, the consumer EV credit, or a similar rebate, to require vehicles and key components to be built here in order to receive the incentive, and to support the retention and growth of good-paying jobs. The updated credit should also facilitate purchase of EVs by those who would not otherwise be able to. And it is absolutely critical that we invest to make the United States a leading manufacturer of EVs and the technology that goes into them. That means taking action to expand, retool, and convert US automotive and component manufacturing through the Advanced Technology Vehicle Manufacturing Loan Program, manufacturing conversion grants, and the 48C Manufacturing Investment Tax Credit, which applies to a wide range of manufacturing clean energy technologies, as well as to the automotive sector. We need to onshore critical supply chains, such as batteries, cells, and the materials that go into them, including through a new manufacturing investment tax credit and production tax credit. We need to modernize and cut emissions from our energy-intensive industrial base, as I've heard other speakers mention, and target investment to revitalize manufacturing communities and build new pathways into family-supporting careers. Auto and components manufacturing employs around 1 million workers directly and millions more indirectly, from mining and steel making to engines and batteries to final assembly to auto dealerships and the multitude of local jobs supported in manufacturing communities. We're already fighting against decades of short-sighted policy and investment decisions that have spurred offshoring and outsourcing and cost manufacturing jobs. Those choices have driven down the living and working standards of manufacturing workers, often hitting Black workers first and hardest, and cost access to family supporting careers in too many communities. At the same time, the United States is already lagging far behind our competitors in investments to capture EV manufacturing and jobs and to ensure that good advanced engine and transmission powertrain jobs of today become the good EV propulsion jobs of tomorrow. But we can and must reverse these trends and take a better path. Whether or not working people across America see the gains from the coming clean economy depends on what Congress does now. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you all so much. All of your testimony was insightful and very constructive, and we appreciate it. So now we'll move on to questions. I'll recognize myself first for 5 minutes for questions. Ms. Andrade, thank you so much for all of your work in the state of Florida and the Southeast. It's great news that you are targeting expansion. I mean, neighbors back home, they are hungry for to lower their electric bills and to weatherize their homes. And it is a bear to try to find the capital, a little bit of a loan to help them get there. But we know it has such incredible benefits in lowering their costs and lowering pollution for everyone. So we're headed into a big bipartisan agreement here where we're going to be able to target a number of different initiatives to lower cost and ramp up renewables. You recommended to us kind of a green bank model that has worked well in other regions of the country. How can this go through how an accelerator should be structured, and how do we ensure that we're really getting help to folks who truly need it, working class communities of color that have long carried a disproportionate burden of pollution and often have trouble getting those loan dollars?
Yes, thank you very much, Representative Castor. That's a very good question, and I'm happy to try and address it as best I can. Green banks, there are 22 green banks across the nation right now. They take different forms and shapes depending on each state and the needs. One of the advantages of green banks is that they can adapt to the needs of each state and community. We're very flexible, nimble, and because typically they're independent nonprofits, we happen to be the only CDFI, but other structures are quasi-state funded. They have a combination of capital. They really can address the specific issues in each state. So currently there are efforts across the nation to start up more new green banks, because what green banks do is really facilitate and channel funding from the private, public, and philanthropic sector into communities for these different purposes, whether it's EVs, whether it's resilience and solar, or a combination of all of those. We are proposing, and what we find is that there's a huge demand, of course, as we're all talking about here, but especially the low and moderate income community, with the working class Americans, are being left behind and can't access the benefits of the clean energy economy. It's always been kind of the, something that the wealthy can access. The tax credits are typically something that low income communities can't access, even the solar tax credits. So we find that funding a clean energy accelerator would allow green banks across the nation to proliferate, to also capitalize our existing funds so that we can create more programs. And in that creation, there is a provision to earmark 40% of the funding for LMI communities to ensure equitable deployment of capital. And one of the last comments would be that importantly, green banks, because they're independent and nonprofit, which is the way we're recommending that the Clean Energy Accelerator be structured as an independent nonprofit, that allows us to crowd in more capital, to leverage the balance sheet and not be tied to federal funds that are not flexible. Green banks across the nation are leveraging these public funding 8-to-1, self-started with a Department of Energy grant from the previous American Reinvestment and Recovery Act. And here we are 10 years later, and we've leveraged public-private funding 8 times, and we continue to expand. So that is our recommendation, is invest in these green banks that can multiply the effects, the capital, and the job creation throughout.
Thank you very much. And I've just back home in the Tampa Bay area, I keep meeting all of these new small business owners and startups that are getting into this business. And I know that, again, there is a hunger out there among neighbors across all communities to lower their electric bills. And I love the win-win-win proposition of it all. So Ms. Lippman, I loved checking out the new Ford F-150 Lightning the other day. I know they have already over 100,000 on order, and these are good American-made vehicles. We have got to win the global competition. I have all the faith in the world in our auto workers and all along the supply chains. So we're working on the blend of tax credits. Highlight for us quickly again the priorities here to make sure that consumers can access these vehicles and we can build them ASAP.
Thanks very much for that question. I think we're really excited by products like you mentioned as well. It's exactly what we want to see the future look like in the automotive sector. I think we're rightly recognizing that worldwide, our competitors in Europe and Asia are rushing ahead to take advantage of this coming industry globally. If we're going to ensure we capture this opportunity, we need both to make this U.S. a leading market, and to spur deployment, and to ensure that we do that in both the electric vehicle, for cars, for trucks, and through fleets, as well as in charging, and to ensure that across those incentives, we are supporting both high labor standards. So we're ensuring we're building as good or better jobs in the clean technologies of the future as we are in the jobs today.
Unfortunately, Zoe, Ms. Lippman, my time is short.
Oh, sorry.
A lot of members, and we're going to talk more about
manufacturing incentives.
You're going to get some other questions from members. So I'm going to
Sure.
go now and recognize Ms. Miller on you're recognized for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Castor and Ranking Member Graves, and thank you all for being here today. I do want to say that I strongly support 45Q and carbon capture and all of the progress we have made scientifically moving forward. If we on this committee are really serious about addressing climate change and ensuring that the Americans and the rest of us all around the globe can access affordable and reliable energy, we must embrace carbon capture. Some of my colleagues across the aisle need to broaden their view on how carbon capture can impact everybody around the world. Utilization of carbon capture will allow us to continue to use cheap baseload energy, which would also include coal. Specifically, exporting this technology abroad will help the developing nations power up, as they are behind us in so many ways, while we will also be reducing global emissions. It's a win-win situation. That's why keeping incentives in place to help fine-tune the technology is key. Making carbon capture accessible and affordable is really a critical first step. Mr. Powell, what steps are needed to make carbon capture available worldwide?
Well, thank you so much, Congresswoman Miller, and thank you for your leadership on this very important issue. The recent legislation that you introduced as part of Leader McCarthy's energy innovation package, I think, is a terrific first step to make this more accessible. So amongst other things, just to summarize, your legislation effectively made the credit in the tax code. It effectively doubled the value of the credit from its current state up to something more, so $85 a ton, and then paying out for more years, which would effectively double its value. And very importantly, it radically increased the number of facilities, including even very small facilities, that would be able to take advantage of and capture that credit. So collectively, that hugely expands the number of facilities that could take on something like this. What we have learned in the experience of both radically reducing the cost of natural gas-fired power and in wind and solar is that deployment is key to bring down costs. We learn by doing the more of these things we install. So if we can use a significantly enhanced credit like that to hugely increase the uptake of this across more and more facilities and start building out the infrastructure across the country that could move that captured CO2 either to permanent sequestration sites or to places where it can be utilized for other means as a commodity, that'll be a terrific first step. And then we need to think about strengthening our export authorities in this space so that we can get that technology out to more of the rapidly developing world. And there are a number of things we could do there as well.
That's part of it because of the worldwide need. How would this utilization of technologies like the carbon capture reduce energy poverty?
Absolutely. So across the world, there are enormous remaining fossil fuel assets. In many places, they're an extremely affordable way to both generate electricity and to power heavy industry or to heat cities. If there is some way that we can continue using these resources in a low emissions future, that's a terrific tool to keep available for the rapidly developing world. If you look at countries like China and Indonesia, they are continuing to build coal-fired power plants and coal-fired power technology because they have tremendous coal reserves. Many other countries have tremendous gas reserves. Frankly, if we don't find some way to allow those countries to retrofit a lot of what they've built with carbon capture technology, I don't see any path to solving the global emissions challenge and actually reducing the risks of climate change. There's just so much steel in the ground now that's using these assets. Literally a terawatt of coal in China, the size of the entire US power grid alone, and still rapidly developing in a number of other countries.
Don't you think the utilization of this technology would also create jobs in the developing nations as well?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at China alone, there are, for better or for worse, there are 10 million people employed in the coal value chain in China alone, and hundreds of thousands and millions in many other rapidly developing countries. To preserve those jobs in many of those places, or even to expand the jobs in this industry, but to do so in a more responsible way going forward, to capture the emissions, that's a win-win for development and for global clean energy.
Because they're going to keep doing it. Thank you so much. I yield back my time.
Okay, next up, Rep. Bonamici, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chair Castor and Ranking Member Graves, and thank you to our witnesses. So this is a hearing about financing climate solutions and job creation. And I serve on the Education and Labor Committee, and I do a lot of work in the workforce area. So I'm going to focus on the job creation part of this hearing. And I'm to follow up on Representative Miller's questioning. My grandfather was a coal miner, my granddaughter of a coal miner. And I know that what's important is to transition to a clean energy economy while making workers a priority. We have the opportunity to create millions of good paying, high quality union jobs as we make this transition, but it can't be a race to the bottom in terms of wages. And that's what I'm concerned that there's this fear across the country that people won't get good jobs, they'll get low paying jobs. And that is a concern. We need to make worker protections and workforce development a priority. And our climate action plan integrates Buy American requirements, Davis-Bacon prevailing wage requirements, and the use of community benefit agreements and project labor agreements into federal clean energy and resilience investments. And that's important. Our transition to a clean energy economy also offers an opportunity to connect people who are unemployed or underemployed with the training they need to access those jobs. And earlier this year, I reintroduced my bipartisan Bicameral Builds Act. And that bill supports people who have historically faced barriers to employment, particularly women and people of color. It gives them access to registered apprenticeships and the support services they need to secure those good paying, high quality jobs in transportation, clean energy, construction, and infrastructure. So Ms. Lipman, the Blue-Green Alliance's manufacturing agenda does highlight the importance of high quality jobs with labor standards and creating pathways for more people to access those jobs. So how can tools like community benefit agreements and investments and registered apprenticeships help improve those economic opportunities, particularly for frontline communities, and increase access to good paying manufacturing jobs.
Thanks so much. You've already laid out some of the key priorities here. We need to ensure, as I started to mention previously, that as we deploy, as we have incentives of any kind, public funding of any kind that deploys this technology, that it comes with high labor standards, with incentives to utilize the kinds of community benefit and community workforce agreements that you mentioned, that we invest in sufficient scale to ensure that we can rebuild the manufacturing communities, and both the community, invest in the communities and the workers who need it most, and that we target this investment to a whole range of communities who have seen disinvestment, and where we can ensure that we are bringing back good paying industrial jobs to industrial communities that have lost them, and energy communities that have lost them, as you mentioned, as well as to ensure that we are providing investment in communities that have historically been excluded from that investment. And that, as someone else mentioned earlier, that the benefits from this clean energy transition reach every community, that we see EV charging in rural and low-income communities, not just where the market might provide it.
Absolutely. Thank you. And also, Ms. Lippman, what federal investments would help scale up our nation's manufacturing supply chain to meet the needs of transitioning to a clean energy economy? And how can Congress support efforts to retool existing factories or facilities, or incentivize new businesses to manufacture EVs and clean energy technologies? What would we need to do to
absolutely. We have a host of tools at our disposal that we have the opportunity to more robustly fund and use more aggressively. Those include the Advanced Technology Vehicle Manufacturing Loan Program that could be expanded and used more broadly. We need to fund a manufacturing conversion grants program that would help ensure that we retool facilities that may be at risk of closure to build the technologies of the future. And we need to, in addition to, as we mentioned, the domestic manufacturing conditions on the deployment incentives, look at a new manufacturing investment and production tax credits to fill the supply chain gaps that we've seen so vividly missing here, and that are so important to bring battery and cell and other production here, not to mention things like semiconductors.
Right.
So for all of these things, it will be critical, not to mention targeting these investments to the
tremendous amount of potential. Thank you, Madam Chair. As I yield back, I just want to take a moment to thank Maxine Sugarman, my staff, who's been with me for 6 years and has staffed me on not only the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, but also on many of the labor and education issues and Science Committee issues. Maxine is heading off to law school soon, but I just want to thank her for her exemplary work over the years, particularly on this.
Well, thank you, Rep. Bonamici. And Maxine has been a wonderful staff member, part of the Climate Crisis family here. And she hasn't just helped you out, but she's helped out the entire committee. So good luck in law school, Maxine. I think you're just getting started out there in the world.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to Congressman Gonzalez. Good morning. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, and thank you for holding this hearing. I have to start, unfortunately, I deeply respect the chair and everybody on this committee and everyone across Congress. I have to respectfully disagree with the idea that we're having a remote hearing today. From what I can tell, there's no guidance whatsoever that suggests that we cannot meet in person safely. I think over 85% of members are vaccinated. I don't know what percent of this committee I've been vaccinated from day one. I urge all my constituents to do it. I know there's still hesitancy out there, but there is nothing anywhere that suggests that we can't figure out a way to meet safely in person. And I think it's important that we show the country that we can go back to normal and stay normal and meet in person. Also, I think it's worth noting this is a global virus, much like climate change. This is a global virus, and there will be variants for the rest of our lives. There is effectively zero chance that we are going to eradicate COVID from planet Earth. And if we run and hide every time that there is a variant, we will never ever get back to normal. And I don't know, I'm a parent of young kids. My wife and I, we're not wild about locking ourselves up for another year if that's the way that this is going to happen. And I know that my constituents feel the exact same way.
Well, I want to thank you, Rep. Gonzalez, because this was my call, and I thought, well, since all of our witnesses were remote and it was a 9 a.m. early morning hearing, that just for convenience sake, we would do it. If we were in the committee room, we would be masked, and this is a little more comfortable way to do it. But I prefer the in-person hearings, and we'll be doing those on a more regular basis. But please, everybody, if you're not vaccinated, get vaccinated so that we can crush COVID. And I won't ding you on. I won't ding you on your time here. You'll get some extra time. So please go ahead.
Well, yes, ma'am, and that's good to hear. So I appreciate that explanation. So as I said, it is good to see everyone, and I thank the witnesses for joining us. As I've said, no doubt climate change is a challenge that warrants our attention. But like any issue, we do need a policy approach that is realistic and cost effective. It requires we balance a broad array of interests and commitments, such as energy security, economic growth, competitiveness with Russia and China, and human rights. The good news is there's quite a bit of common ground on these policies, particularly on innovation, a competitive advantage that the US can tap that exists nowhere else in the world. In my view, policy proposals should be focused on stimulating an innovation ecosystem here in the US that have the potential to drive real technological breakthroughs that are affordable and reduce our carbon footprint. To that end, I recently introduced the Steel Upgrading Partnerships and Emissions Reduction Act, which passed out of the Science Committee, or the Super Act, legislation that would establish a program at DOE to further the research, development, demonstration, and commercial application of breakthrough technologies for low emission steel manufacturing. By developing and commercializing these technologies, we can ensure US industry remains competitive in global markets while reducing emissions in the steelmaking process. Again, balancing economic growth with emissions reduction. I've also introduced the Coordinated Action to Capture Harmful Emissions Act, a bill that would expand the values of the 45Q tax credit for carbon capture technology and eliminate the arbitrary thresholds on facilities that limit deployment. Mr. Powell, I appreciated your testimony because you're absolutely right that carbon capture has to be a central focus of our effort to decarbonize the power and industrial sectors. I don't know how we can do it without carbon capture. Innovation, public-private partnerships, and incentive-based actions have proven to work, and each of these bills relies on these proven abilities, and I encourage my colleagues to consider each bill as we debate policy solutions. So, Mr. Powell, I want to start my questions with you, and first off, it's good to see you. Reasonable estimates of the Green New Deal suggest the electricity portion alone costs around $500 billion per year, or about $4,000 annually per American household. I want to highlight this because I, again, think it's important we recognize that massive reductions in greenhouse gas emissions do have a cost associated with them, and it's going to force us to deal with various trade-offs. There is a great deal of interest, investment, and talent going into various technologies, but which are you most excited about, and how can Congress accelerate their development?
Well, first, again, thank you, Representative Gonzalez, for your terrific leadership on this. I think that between the terrifically named Super Act and Catch Acts, I think that starts to set up really a comprehensive regime to think about radically reducing the cost of steel and other commodities in the industrial sector. Just to reiterate, industrial emissions actually in the United States last year for the first time were about equal to power sector emissions, and most estimates have them going to being the predominant source of emissions in the United States by 2030. So finding ways through innovation and incentives to start bringing those down alongside all the success we've had in power and increasingly in transportation, I think is very important. You know, unfortunately, there's no silver bullet technology. We need a portfolio of approaches to do this. Carbon capture is extremely important, and for many parts of the industrial sector, that's the most available technology today, literally just kind of putting a cap on top of the facility and capturing those emissions. Over time, we should also be looking, particularly in the industrial sector, at ways to do things differently within those facilities. A huge source of those emissions are heat in the industrial sector. Today, in many blast furnace steel plants, for example, a lot of that heat comes from either natural gas or coking coal, part of the process. If we could find some alternative way to produce that heat in a fully clean way, either with clean hydrogen or high temperature nuclear reactors or heat generating units with carbon capture on them themselves, that will be a huge step forward. And then lastly, we can think about entirely new ways to run those processes. There are now electrochemical approaches well under development and heavily under finance in the venture capital sector, entirely new ways to reduce the iron or reduce the oxygen out of iron oxide, the first part of the steelmaking process. We should be deeply investing in a basic and applied research and demonstrations of those advanced technologies as well.
Thank you. I see my time's almost up, but I think it's helpful to think about it that way. Is, how far along on the R&D curve are we when it comes to decarbonizing the industrial sector? I think from an R&D standpoint, we've developed a lot of technologies in the power sector. We need to make them more efficient, bring the cost down, et cetera. But looking at the industrial sector, where are we and how can we make improvements going forward? I think should be a central focus for this committee and much of Congress. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to Congresswoman Brownlee. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for having this hearing. My first question is to Ms. Andrade. Hopefully I'm pronouncing your name somewhat correctly. Today we're talking a lot about green banks, which you did, and clean energy tax credits. And I just wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit how these two things can really sort of complement each other. And so if you could speak to that.
Thank you. Yes, so I think Mr. Powell said something that I just want to start with, which is there is no silver bullet to address these issues. And we have to work in multi-layer and multi-lane programs to address these issues. Green banks can bring capital into communities to solve a series of issues, specifically to finance everything from R&D that has been talked about here to EV financing for low and moderate income or not. And the financing that green banks can deploy is flexible and can leverage additional capital. So for example, one of the things that we have been hearing more and more is that developers that are building affordable housing don't really go that extra mile to build the climate resilient, maximum energy efficient, and even solar or wind powered buildings because of the cost. So that's where tax credits come in, for example, where if there were tax credits that incentivized and motivated resilience investment, solar investments, there is a federal tax credit for solar, but the capture of that tax credit remains at a very high level for the developers. It doesn't go down to the tenants, for example. Typically, it's used to fill those capital stacks and to make the financing work. So what we're finding is that there is a need for more flexible, low-cost capital to complete these capital stacks so we can invest in better buildings that are resilient, that are efficient, that are not only affordable to get into and to rent or to own, but actually to operate over time. So that's the gap that a combination of low-cost flexible capital deployed through green banks and a policy of tax credit that motivates energy efficiency and climate resilience can bring together, can really unleash and catalyze a whole new standard of building in a way that works for everybody, for developers that want to make profits, for people that live in those homes, and for communities that are trying to stabilize and revitalize.
Thank you very much. Mr. Larson, I'm working on a bill on sustainable aviation fuel, and I think we're moving forward certainly with a production incentive tax. And my question is, this is sort of a new emerging area. we haven't had a tax incentive federally for aviation and this particular area. So I'm wondering, I believe, and I want to just hear what your opinion is that to really get this industry going, we need both. We need both the investment and the production tax credit. Can you give your opinion on that?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. I think the most important thing to keep in mind in policy design for all of this is something Rich Powell said, which is the way we get all of these technologies to get down in cost is through deployment, right? And so, and that goes for everything from an electric vehicle to the next generation of wind farms to sustainable aviation fuel. And I think there's lots of different combinations of incentives and tax credits that can meet that general goal of accelerating deployment and getting costs down. I don't think any investor is going to go big on major production of clean fuels without knowing that there's going to be a market for it. And one way to do that is through a production incentive. At the same time, these are very large facilities that have a lot of capital involved. And so finding ways to get over that first hurdle of just building the facility is going to be important. I think a combination of PTC and ITC is one way to do that. I think, it could also be through deployment grants out of DOE or something like that, right? There's lots of different, back to the no silver bullet point, right? But I would say, thinking through how different levers can fit together here to get those new technologies to scale is going to be very important.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Great. Next was Mr. Armstrong. Is he there? If not, let's see. Mr. Crenshaw, are you ready? He's not on the screen. So next we'll recognize Mr. Crenshaw for 5 minutes.
All right, I can be ready. We'll do this. Hey, thank you all for being here. Appreciate it. I do have to start out with echoing some of my colleagues' statements. We should be in person. This hearing is about science. Our decisions here in the Capitol should be about science. I could go into a long tirade about where the CDC got their guidance and where our own house doctor got their guidance. We've all been vaccinated. It's safe. We need to show some leadership. I would also say, I don't know how we're supposed to keep engaging in bipartisanship when the majority is threatening the minority with fines and jail time for not wearing a mask. This has gone too far. It's gone way too far. You're demeaning us, making us walk through metal detectors to get into the House floors, if that makes any security sense whatsoever. We have to stop this so that we can get to the real work, which is policy. Okay, so now I will transition to policy. And I want to start with asking the question. When we're talking about tax incentives and ways to decrease global emissions, that is a common goal. Can't emphasize that enough. But is it about reducing carbon emissions, or is it about promoting wind and solar? And are wind and solar just getting preferential treatment? And they are, of course. For instance, why is there a pushback on moving from a PTC and ITC to a tech neutral tax credit? That seems like a common sense thing to do, because the reality is that solar and wind can't possibly power the economy. It's a total fallacy to believe that can happen. And I can tell you just with a few statistics, it takes 3 to 4 times more land to power the same amount of energy for solar than it would for nuclear. Just for instance, from a capacity standpoint, solar and wind operate at about 30%, nuclear, gas, coal operate above 90%. This matters, and you also can't change this fact. It's just a basic law of physics, and it matters quite a bit. We talk about environmental justice all the time, but what about energy justice? What about the right of people to have power when they need it? And so dedicating incentives and regulatory changes only towards solar and wind, I'm not sure it'll be successful. I'm not sure it makes any sense. And it certainly won't create jobs the way that many of my colleagues have proposed. So why are we against a carbon capture credit as well? we said it's too harmful because, well, you're still pulling fossil fuels out of the ground. But again, is the goal to reduce carbon emissions globally, or is the goal just to push a very specific industry in the United States? And now the argument's been made that that industry creates jobs, like these tax incentives will create jobs. But here's the thing. And by the way, the Washington Post had to fact check John Kerry for making this claim that solar and wind jobs were some of the fastest growing in America. Well, by a percentage growth, yes, but by absolute value, almost no growth whatsoever. We would be losing hundreds of thousands of jobs. We lost 800,000 jobs in the past year in the oil and gas sector just because there was a dip in demand. And that's how sensitive this job market is. So it's also worth noting, on average, solar and wind jobs pay $20,000 less than an oil and gas job. If we wanted to create a lot more jobs, and especially manufacturing jobs and good paying ones, we'd build more nuclear plants. We'd build more nuclear plants and we'd build more carbon capture stations. We have private companies that are really I get briefs on it all the time, especially in the Houston area. You can have massive effects on carbon reduction with this. You can have massive effects on carbon reduction with exporting more of our natural gas because we burn it cleaner when we produce it cleaner than any other country in the world. But if we give that up and global demand for energy keeps going up, as it will, well, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Russia will meet that demand, and they'll do it with much dirtier energy. You see how much time I have left here? Very little. Okay. Mr. Powell, can I ask you a quick question? Depending on the other climate solutions proposed, could jobs gained through a tax incentive just be lost through additional regulatory actions?
Well, first, thanks, Congressman Crenshaw, for your leadership across these issues, your support of the Energy Act last year, your leadership on carbon capture and geothermal and regulatory reform. I do think we should remember, to your point, that the incentives we put into the system are also dependent on having a permitting and regulatory system such that those incentives will actually allow us to build in a timely fashion all the things that we want to build. And so it's very, very sensitive on the other end to having, for example, NEPA processes that actually allow timely environmental impact statements and yes or no answers to actually cite and permit things on an expeditious timeline, or regulations to safely store and cite carbon capture permits and facilities and pipelines. And so we can't leave out the really important process of reforming and streamlining our regulatory processes so that we're not kind of pushing on a string, right? We're not putting more incentives in and spending more, but actually not getting a lot of projects actually out of the back end as a result of those incentives.
Thank you. I'm out of time. I yield back.
Thank you. And Mr. Crenshaw, I know you joined the committee this Congress. I recommend to you go back and read the section of our Solving the Climate Crisis Action Plan, where we have a significant section on carbon capture and storage with a lot of good recommendations that I think are can provide some bipartisan ways forward. And we highlight the fact that especially in the steel, cement, other industrial processes, we do not have the answers on how we're going to capture carbon and how we need to invest in R&D there. And I think that this could be an area of a bipartisan agreement moving forward. So I recommend that to you. And next we'll go to, before we go to Representative Caston, if you all haven't seen his riffs on the House floor and social media on hot FERC summer, I recommend those to you as well. So next, Rep. Caston, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will not be rapping today, much to your displeasure, I'm sure. I really appreciate you all having this hearing, as you've heard me say many times before. Getting to a clean energy economy is synonymous with getting to a cheap energy economy. And with the exception of carbon capture and storage, which is a total economic boondoggle, we're going to get to that. Every clean energy technology we have has a lower operating cost than the technology it displaces. And I wish that wasn't partisan. My goodness, I'm getting exhausted hearing my friends across the aisle say that what we need to do is to subsidize energy sources that are slashing their prices and losing market share. I don't know what that is, but it isn't capitalism. So let's talk about markets. Let's talk about the challenges of deploying low-cost technologies, getting them through that valley of death. And we did that with Title 17 of the Loan Program Office in the ARA, and was actually hugely successful, deployed over $30 billion. There's a lot of hype around some of their losses, but I think they've generated $3 billion in interest revenue and only had $1 billion in losses. We should be expanding that program. In my prior life, I actually participated in that program. And one of the challenges that we've still never fixed is that when that program was set up, Congress, in their wisdom or lack thereof, said that the credit subsidy would have to be paid essentially as an added fee. So that what happened was that while we set this out to say, let's provide lower cost guaranteed debt to help these companies come forward, what we effectively did was increase the equity participation in those programs. I wasn't sure who I was going to ask my next question to, but Ms. Lippman, I see you nodding your head. And briefly, because I want to get to a couple of things, but would you confirm that that's a problem, or would you disagree? Because it looks like you've got some experience there as well.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's a huge opportunity to address that particular issue, but also to more broadly utilize the loan programs, the manufacturing loan programs, and the grant authority of DOE to get at exactly what many folks have been talking about here, moving these technologies up through commercialization into full deployment, and particularly in the industrial sector, where we have a tremendous opportunity to reinvest and transform, as well as across clean energy and clean energy manufacturing.
So I totally agree, and I was pleased we actually voted on the floor last night. We had an amendment that myself and Mr. McEachin put in to start the process of eliminating that credit subsidy, so that we can actually use the program as I think Congress intended, to provide a lower cost source of capital to these technologies. Ms. Andrade, one of the ideas that we've been kicking around is that the U.S. buys about $8 billion of appliances every month. And I think LMI communities are about half of that number. If we could fix the credit subsidy problem, is there any reason we couldn't use that program to essentially provide low interest financing to help LMI communities accelerate their acquisition of energy efficient appliances that are going to leave more money in their pocket every time the rent comes due, because someone pay for energy? Structurally, could we do that?
Thank you, Representative. I think that you could definitely do that. And again, it's one more layer that would benefit this transition to clean energy economy. We need all the tools in the toolbox. And you're talking about appliances. One of the things that's interesting to note is that in LMI communities, a lot of times there's this like sharing of old appliances where, when an old appliance doesn't work well anymore, they pass it on to a neighbor. And this really creates tremendous inefficiencies. And it's a huge cost for community members, households, but also they are high carbon emitting appliances. So yes, we should work at this level where tax credits can incentivize the switch out of these old inefficient appliances with new technologies that are low carbon emitting and more efficient. So that's one layer, but that still doesn't solve the whole problem.
I'm sorry, because we're tight on time, but I would love to do that, and I'd love to work with this committee to do it, because I think we need to expand the actual authority and the renewable and efficiency part of the LPO to do that, but I think there's an opportunity. Just lastly, I want to close on CCS. Mr. Powell, should we be using the 45Q program to accelerate the release of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere?
We should be. Can you repeat that? Can you repeat the end of that question?
Should we be using the 45Q program to accelerate the release of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere?
No, and the 45Q credit obviously does the opposite.
Then for goodness sake, let's stop subsidizing enhanced oil recovery. Pumping low density gases underground to accelerate the release of high density sources of carbon does not reduce CO2 in the atmosphere. It's a boondoggle. We need to stop pretending that 45Q doesn't need massive restorations. I'm out of time. Thank you. Yield back.
All right, next up, Ranking Member Graves, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, we'll start to yield 30 seconds to Mr. Crenshaw.
I thank the gentleman from Louisiana, and I thank the chairwoman for expressing the bipartisanship that can exist on carbon capture and utilization. But I have to point out that all of the environmental justice literature is completely against carbon capture. And Representative Caston just spent his entire time calling it a boondoggle. Okay, so this is why I expressed that there is actually disagreement. And to the chairwoman's point, I think there can be agreements, and I would like us to get there. I yield back.
Good. Thank you. Madam Chair, I wasn't planning on doing this, but I do think that Mr. Crenshaw's earlier line of comments are appropriate. We're talking about science and we're being asked to follow the science. Yet, as we're witnessing right now, we're being asked to wear masks again. But then the same leadership are the folks that built a plexiglass chamber on the House floor to actually allow for COVID positive people to come into the House chamber. And as we know, there's no pathway you can walk without walking through the Capitol and sharing your germs with everyone. And that was done solely for a political purpose of electing Pelosi Speaker. It's the same party that without any threat assessment at all, is diverting 12 or 15 officers, as long as we're in session, to the House floor whenever U.S. Capitol Police is actually understaffed and the threat is truly on the outside. And so I think Mr. Crenshaw's line was exactly right, and that it's really hard in some cases to think that folks are operating in good faith and truly on science whenever they just use it when it's convenient. And now I want to pivot back to the topic of this hearing. Mr. Larson, I want to understand something. You responded to a question a minute ago where you said that the best way, and I think you were referencing Mr. Powell's comments as well, the best way to bring down costs is through deployment. I said in my opening, we've had solar wind for decades now. I've heard Mr. Caston and others talk about how it is the most affordable source of electricity, but then in your testimony, you said that we need to extend and expand the ITC and PTC. Can you help me understand that quickly, please?
Sure, happy to, and it's a great question. Essentially, in the absence of any other deployment policy to decarbonize the electric power sector, tax credits can do a lot to meet that same goal, right? So if you don't have either some sort of EPA regulations or a clean electric standard or some other policy driving decarbonization, then tax credits are a tool.
But why do you need them if it's already the most affordable? I mean, shouldn't the market drive you to that solution if it's the most affordable? What am I not understanding about that?
I mean, one key nuance there is the most affordable new generation. There is a lot of existing natural gas with no carbon capture on it that is just as competitive as that new renewables, and it's already built and it can run, right?
So when you say when folks say it's the least expensive, they're talking about just operating. They're not talking about the actual CapEx and everything else that goes into it. Is that?
No, I mean, I think what they're saying is when you build something new, renewables are the cheapest option. But that doesn't mean when you're dispatching the grid, it's always the cheapest thing to go. In fact, there's 400 gigawatts of gas combined cycle units that can run quite cheaply on very low variable O&M and fuel costs, right? And so, and all of that emits. And so that's the other key challenge here that wind and solar need to get ahead of.
Thank you. Mr. Powell, United States being able to take advantage of clean energy technologies to utilize our resources is important. Can you talk about the global importance of development of technologies, including more important affordable technologies that allow developing world to have reliable, low emissions? Doesn't it make sense that we develop the technology in the United States and then export it to India and other developing nations?
Absolutely, Congressman Graves. And again, thank you for your leadership across these issues, and particularly your focus on permitting reform to get clean energy built faster. I think this global picture has two fundamental pieces. One, very quickly, in response to Congressman Caston's last point, we have to remember we're in a global market for commodities like oil. So if we use enhanced oil, CO2-based enhanced oil recovery here in the United States, that's offsetting another barrel of much dirtier oil produced somewhere else in the world, for example, in the Russian Arctic. So we are actually lowering global carbon dioxide emissions, even though we are using it to produce another barrel of oil here in the United States. Very, very important point. It's a little sophisticated point about how global oil markets work, but really important one to remember. Similarly, on the global technology market, we need to remember we're in a race with a number of other very aggressive countries globally to supply the rapidly developing world with the power plants and the industrial equipment that they're going to use to develop and modernize. A lot of the other players in that race, China in particular, talks a good game about climate change, but doesn't necessarily prioritize selling clean energy technologies to those developing markets. In fact, through the Belt and Road Initiative, they've been very happy to heavily subsidize, finance, build, and supply even really inefficient, subcritical coal technologies, things we wouldn't allow to be built in the United States today because they're so inefficient and so polluting on so many dimensions. And so we've got to remember that we're up against really tough competitors globally. We need better solutions. We need cheaper, higher performing solutions, and we need packages of incentives like the support of the Export-Import Bank or the Development Finance Corporation, so we can actually go head to head with what China is offering to the developing world and change their emissions trajectory.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for allowing a little extra time there. And I just want to say, I think Mr. Crenshaw's comments about, look, the only way we're going to get anywhere is us working together. And I think that there's plenty of, as you and I have discussed, plenty of areas where we do agree. And it's important for us to get back together, to work together to achieve some of these mutual goals. I yield back.
Yeah, I trust we're going to have those opportunities shortly if some bipartisan packages come over from the United States Senate soon. So next we'll go to Congresswoman Escobar. Good morning. Welcome. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Madam Chair, and thank you so much for having this hearing for us and bringing us together this morning. And to our panelists, thank you so much for all that you have shared so far and for the work that you're doing. I'm really grateful for it. I want to begin with a very general question, and then I want to dive into some specific questions as they relate to my community. But Mr. Larson, you began your comments kind of laying out, very clearly some specific tasks that Congress could accomplish. And in that spirit of what you shared with us, what I'd like to ask our other panelists is a couple of quick, what's some low-hanging fruit that you think Congress immediately can jump on to achieve some quick wins? Because my belief is that having some easy, quick wins on climate builds momentum. And with that momentum, we're able to then begin to tackle some of the more difficult conversations, which you all have witnessed here during this hearing today. But if I can start with Ms. Lippman, low-hanging fruit, easy wins that you would tell us to get to work on immediately.
Manufacturing conversion grants. We have such an opportunity to invest in companies that want to move into clean technologies of all kinds, and may be faced with changes in the market that can't respond to now in ways that save jobs and save good jobs. And it's a great opportunity to help folks move into these sectors and keep jobs here in the US.
Thank you. Ms. Andrade?
Thank you. Yes, some low-hanging fruits would be to increase funding for the existing weatherization insulation programs, so-called WAPs, LIHEAPs, but also just provide funding to green banks that are in existence so that they can capitalize and catalyze and leverage those funds, so that instead of just having a certain amount in these programs, we actually have 8 or 10 times more. So that coupled with, honestly, I think that we have to include a climate resiliency tax credit along with the solar tax credit or any other tax credit, so that we motivate energy efficiency as a first step. That's the low-hanging fruit, energy efficiency and resilience, and then all the other technologies, especially for LMI communities.
Thank you, Ms. Andrade. Before I head to Mr. Powell for any low-hanging fruit suggestions he has, you essentially identified what I was going to be asking you about. I represent an economically disadvantaged community out in the middle of the Chihuahuan Desert, where we suffer frequently from severe drought. And then we sometimes swing over to extreme flooding. But many of our families are unable to really protect themselves against the extreme heat because of lack of access to weatherization for their own homes. So I may get back to you if we have time on that issue in just a sec. Mr. Powell, low-hanging fruit, quick ideas.
pass the energy sector innovation credit. It's bipartisan, it's bicameral, it has support from leadership in both Senate Finance and House Ways and Means. It's poised for passage. It would put all advanced clean energy generating technologies on an equal footing with a leg up to get those into the market and deploy quickly and lower the cost. So we'd have a whole portfolio of things to use here in the United States and export to the developing world.
Thank you. And Mr. Larson, anything you want to add as a footnote to the great list that you gave us during your remarks?
I think I'd just reiterate a couple of key components. One is allowing credit flexibility. So, a technology or developer to choose either the ITC or the PTC is really important to actually broadening the scope of opportunities for investment across America, and also can really hypercharge deployment by doing so. And I think just that tweak to the existing tax credit framework would be quite impactful.
Great, thank you. And I have probably only 30 seconds, Ms. Lippman. Want to ask you a quick question. In my community, the El Paso Chamber of Commerce is working with our university and our electric utility on a model that ensures that vehicle batteries can plug into the grid and sell excess energy back to the grid. They estimate that it could mean an additional $500 income for consumers who own an electric vehicle. How can Congress support more of these kind of vehicle to grid models?
Sure. And in 7 seconds, I would say there are numerous tools. It's an exciting opportunity to both use our tax credits and grants, but also the public sector, the infrastructure funding that would allow both households and things like school systems and municipal bus utilities to create both that bring in the electric vehicles, but also create this vehicle to grid or vehicle to building resilience assets that are there in times of a disaster, but also provide the return to the school system, to the community through the utility services.
Thank you. I'm so sorry, Ms. Andrade, we can't finish our conversation. I'm out of time. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm going to make sure you all get together after the hearing to make that connection. Next up, Rep. Levin, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chair Castor. I'm grateful that you're holding today's hearing on such an important topic. Since I came to Congress in 2019, I've been fighting for the passage of a comprehensive clean energy and clean transportation tax package that'll put our country on the path to a sustainable future. That package would drastically reduce greenhouse gas emissions so we can address the climate crisis that study after study tells us that we face. In April of 2019, I co-led a letter signed by more than 100 of our House colleagues calling for the inclusion of these sorts of policies in the always just around the corner infrastructure package under the prior administration. And we saw and continue to see these clean energy tax policies as a way that our country can combat the climate crisis, grow our economy, and create good jobs all at the same time. Unfortunately, the infrastructure package often discussed under the previous administration seemed to be more about scoring political points and less about actually creating jobs for our constituents. So it never materialized. But this administration, President Biden, has revitalized these infrastructure efforts with the American Jobs Plan, where he calls for an expanded investment tax credit and production tax credit for clean energy generation and storage, along with significant incentives to facilitate electric vehicle adoption and charging infrastructure. I share his vision. Many of our colleagues do as well. And earlier this month, I was really pleased that 133 other members signed a letter of support calling for the climate provisions in the American Jobs Plan. We called for the adoption specifically of a robust 10-year clean energy and transportation tax title, as outlined in the president's proposal. A key part of that, making sure that the clean energy tax credits are made eligible for direct pay, particularly important as we continue the economic recovery from the pandemic, which has made it more challenging to finance clean energy projects. I introduced last Congress the bipartisan Solar Jobs Preservation Act with Representative Schweikert to temporarily create a direct pay option for solar projects that were able to break ground by the end of 2021. It extended the phase down of the tax credit schedule by 1 year. And then this Congress, Earl Blumenauer and I built on that by introducing the Renewable Energy Investment Act to allow either the PTC or ITC to be taken as a direct payment rather than a tax credit. I continue to believe these policies are critical to our effort to build more clean energy projects. Mr. Larson, I'll turn to you for a couple of questions. Your testimony recommends that Congress provide a direct pay or refundability policy to prevent financing bottlenecks that could constrain clean energy deployment. And I know that Rhodium has done a lot of good work in this space. Please say hi to my friend Trevor Hauser if you get a chance. Could you elaborate on the bottlenecks that clean energy development could face and how direct pay specifically could address them?
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially, as you know, you need some sort of tax appetite to monetize the current tax credits the way that the current framework is set up, but without direct pay. It turns out there is a finite pool of capital available to help finance projects that are eligible for these tax credits. In 2020, in the renewable energy sector, the U.S. saw record deployment of wind and solar, and also saw basically the tax equity market hit its functional limits. People, we hear multiple reports of folks either not finding financing or finding very expensive financing because of those constraints. We see just in renewables alone, a doubling of that capacity, those capacity additions up to 65 gigawatts a year, if we're going to get to the clean energy goals we need to see. And there's just no reason to believe that tax equity is currently set up to meet that challenge, especially if you then expand to carbon capture, to EV charging, to all the other technologies that are going to matter here. And so basically, direct pay removes that constraint. It broadens the available capital available to monetize these tax credits and really can accelerate investment across all of these sectors and all of these technologies.
Could you expand on, I know we all have this goal, 500,000 EV chargers, and there has been proposals back and forth, most recently $7.5 billion in the bipartisan infrastructure deal as announced yesterday. But do you have any thoughts on how direct pay could help us achieve the goal of 500,000 EV chargers?
Yeah, I mean, in any kind of like infrastructure investment, like EV charging, there is a long-term game being played, right? Like you are building for the demand you anticipate down the road. What that means is in the immediate term, there's less of a revenue opportunity and less tax appetite for the developers, right? Because they just don't have all of the revenue they anticipate down the road. And direct pay allows those same investments to happen absent that profitability concern in the near term, and really can allow folks to kind of remove some of the risk of investing in these technologies in the near term and really build things out. That's a key component of this.
Thanks, Mr. Larson. I'm out of time, but I hope that everybody takes a look at direct pay. It's good bipartisan policy. And Madam Chair, I'll yield back.
Thanks, Rep. Levin. Next up, Rep. Carter. Good to see you. Good morning. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank all of the witnesses for being here. This is certainly a much needed discussion, but I really want to thank Mr. Powell for being here and for your comments, Mr. Powell, on what I think is the heart of the issue with the Select Committee, and that is global emissions. And I, when we talk about that and in reducing global emissions, particularly while we strengthen the U.S. economy and not allow China and Russia to dominate energy development around the world. And I think there's bipartisan agreement that we need to invest in the innovation of clean technologies. But I'm convinced that we can do that and still grow our economy at the same time. However, there are some of those who differ in what kind of innovation is acceptable. And we need to concentrate on innovations in the U.S. interest and that maintains our energy security and brings down global emissions. The key is global emissions. We do not live in a vacuum here. It's not just the United States. It is the whole world that is contributing to this, and even more so other countries than it is the United States of America. I want to talk about carbon capture, Mr. Powell. The Department of Energy announced last year that they were funding 2 cost-sharing projects in Georgia with Georgia Tech and the Southern States Energy Board. Georgia Tech is researching direct air capture technology under realistic conditions for global deployment, while the other project by Southern States Energy Board in Peachtree Corners is targeting reducing the overall cost of direct air capture. Mr. Powell, are there any encouraging developments in direct air capture technology?
Well, first, thanks so much, Congressman Carter. Great to see you, and thanks for your leadership on these issues, on supporting the Energy Act, on your support for nuclear energy. I was terrific to see those grants go to the great state of Georgia for research into this really important technology. There are some extremely promising developments in this space. I think we should all remember that a lot of folks are setting goals around net zero, and that means that in the future, we might still have some parts of our economy that continue to emit. If, for example, it would be extremely expensive to stop the emissions in that space, but as long as we net them back out with some kind of carbon dioxide removal or direct air capture, that's just fine, right? The climate only cares about the net emissions, right? Not the absolute emissions. And so direct air capture could be a really promising technology that would be a mechanical removal of CO2 from the atmosphere. Some models show that we're going to have to do that at an enormous scale, maybe billions of tons in the future. And so we need to be investing now to radically bring down the cost of that technology. There are now a number of companies that are actively working on it and even getting ready to deploy this technology in the United States. I think the largest project, and the one that's probably the most promising, is Carbon Engineering's proposed project in the Permian Basin, where they're working with Occidental Petroleum. They're going to remove CO2 from the atmosphere at enormous scale, up to 1 million tons a year, and then they're going to put that underground and use it for enhanced oil recovery. And that will actually pretty
I think he froze. I'm sorry for that, but if it's okay, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I'm going to go ahead because the clock is ticking. And I really want to get to this. And what is it about? It's about carbon capture. And I'm sorry you froze there, Mr. Powell, but I want to get to this. So please allow me, if you will. Georgia, and this will be the first time I've ever said this before this committee, but Georgia is the #1 forestry state in the country. And certainly growing trees, and it can sequester more carbon dioxide than the annual U.S. emissions from passenger vehicle travel, forest products, manufacturing facilities, forest harvest operations, and estimated wildfires. What can we do to further incentivize carbon capture through our nation's forest?
So natural climate solutions, particularly in the forestry space, I think are a really important part of this picture. And the most promising thing would be if we could find a way to use those to sequester that CO2 in those forests and forest products, and then to either permanently use them, for example, in building materials, so that never goes back up into the air, or use some of those forest products for bioenergy and combine that with carbon capture and storage. That actually creates negative emissions power generation. Right. Which could be a hugely important way in the future to both continue having a clean energy generating economy and to be pulling CO2 out of the air as we're doing it.
Okay, just a few seconds left. Why don't we use more biomass in this country?
That's a great question. I think that there's some disagreement about the carbon impacts of biomass. I think there's no disagreement that if you combined it with carbon capture, we'd actually have negative emission power generation, and that could be a really powerful tool in our clean energy arsenal.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Powell, and thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Rep. Carter. All right. Well, thanks to our witnesses today. You all have been terrific, provided very insightful, constructive testimony. So thanks again. Oh, okay. Before Gary Palmer makes it under the wire. So Rep. Palmer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I was unavoidably delayed. Mr. Powell, I think some of this has been discussed already, but it's noticed by a witness from our last hearing. Studies show that an estimated 90% of electric vehicle owners earn over $100,000 a year. Yet somehow my Democrat colleagues think we're going to be able to provide every American with an electric vehicle. Do you think giving wealthy individuals thousands of dollars to buy a vehicle that they can clearly afford is a good use of money?
You know, I think the thing we need to remember about electric vehicles is they're only as clean as the power grid that supplies them with power. Our argument would be that the highest and best use of public funds would be making sure that there's a clean grid in the first place to power those electric vehicles. And I think at a ton per ton of carbon dioxide emissions reductions, in most cases, it's more efficient to put incentives and resources into making the grid cleaner than into incentivizing the purchase of the EVs.
But the cost of making the grid cleaner, and they're pushing for a uniform grid, which would basically replace the existing grid, would run into the trillions of dollars, and that's eventually going to be passed on to everybody in the form of higher energy costs, perhaps even taxes and fees. And it will be particularly hard on low-income families. I grew up basically dirt poor, so I understand this. We heated our house with a coal heater that sat in the kitchen. Does that concern you?
Well, Congressman Palmer, I think that this is the reason that we need to think about not radically changing and transforming our grid, but doing everything we can to use the existing grid and the existing infrastructure and the existing assets. That's preserving our existing nuclear plants. That's finding ways to retrofit as much of our existing coal and gas fired power plants with carbon capture technologies as we possibly can. So that's finding ways that we don't have to tremendously overbuild our grid or tremendously overhaul the transmission infrastructure, but to try and keep costs low.
I'm one of these all of the above, but when you talk about, I'm talking about they want to replace the grid. If we maintain the grid that we have, which is a patchwork grid, then we've got to come up with some kind of technology that can store power, energy for days. And that technology doesn't exist right now. And and the grid requires a consistent base load. So if we have this grid, it's going to have to be backed up with some other form of fuel, whether it's nuclear or natural gas. I literally had a Democrat witness recommend using natural gas to back it up, which would require the laying of new pipe.
So we absolutely need flexible and baseload zero emitting sources for a low cost, low carbon power grid in the future. Completely agree with you that energy storage is also a big priority there. I think there's been some really interesting advances in those technologies. There was actually one announced just last week. Form Energy believes that it's made a breakthrough in very long duration energy storage technologies that would be 90% cheaper than today's battery technology, and get around a lot of the really problematic sourcing of critical minerals from China and some of our other geopolitical competitors globally by using iron, which we could source here domestically in the U.S. So
we've got to address the whole issue of the minerals as well. But you have a pretty good understanding of what it will take to build out this grid. My Democrat colleagues think that we only have like 9 years left to get it done. Can we get it done in 9 years? Can we do everything that you want to do in 9 years? Are we doomed? I mean, is this
one, we are not
wild fantasy?
Yeah, we are not doomed. We are not doomed. We do have.
Do you think we only have 9 years left? Do you think we've only got 9?
I do not. So climate change is, I think, best thought of as a chronic condition for the planet. I think that's the better way to think about it than an emergency. It's something we're going to have to deal with for decades, if not centuries. And we've got to marry.
Well, let me cut you off there because I've only got a few seconds left. It's something we're going to have to deal with as long as humankind exists, because the history of climate change is in the geologic record. And it is not necessarily related to the emissions of CO2. CO2 certainly has an impact on it, but in the short term and the long term, in terms of climate change, what we've got to address is natural variation. We're not doing that. And with all due respect to all of the witnesses, this idea that we're going to stop climate change by building a renewable grid, clean energy grid, that's a fantasy. I yield back.
All right. Well, I want to start, I wanted to end where I started today, and that's the need to cut carbon pollution as quickly as possible. We are all witness to the rising harms, the escalating cost, and we've got to do everything in our power to avoid the catastrophic impacts of the climate crisis. It's not some political imperative, it's a scientific imperative, and it's our moral obligation to our kids and our grandkids. And fortunately, we can tap American ingenuity to help solve the climate crisis, and that's what we intend to do. We have made progress, but we have the technologies now to go farther and help deploy them, as all the witnesses said, globally. This is what America does best. We research, we develop, we deploy, we share, and we sell to the rest of the world. And that's what we need to do. But we need federal policies here, tax credits, creative financing policies to help get us there. And that will benefit workers. It'll benefit our neighbors back home. It'll make the air we breathe cleaner. And it'll lift everyone all across this country. So thanks again to all of our witnesses for being here today. Without objection, all members will have 10 business days within which to submit any opening statements and additional written questions for the witnesses. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. Thanks again, everyone. The committee is adjourned.